first take. Shall I?
I thought about that.
Oh, just waiting for a couple more to come in. Ah, some more friends from the Institute. So, welcome everybody, distinguished guests, friends and colleagues from the IWM and from the Uni Wien. Dear students, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second talk in the series of the IWM lectures in Human Sciences 2023, The Changing Fortunes of Cosmopolitanism, Demos, Cosmos, and Globus. The IWM organizes a series of 3 lectures every year to reflect upon different aspects of the humanities, or human sciences as we translate it at our institute. But first I would like to thank our partners at the University of Vienna, Peter Schweitzer, who is the head of the Department of Cultural and Social Anthropology, Yorgos Karamanolis, head of the Department of Philosophy, who graciously agreed to open the talks, the first lecture, and he moderated it. Ulrich Brandt, who is head of the Department of Political Sciences, and Nadia Steiber, head of the Department of Sociology. Thank you all very much for this cooperation, the co-organization, co-sponsoring, which we really value. We value our cooperation with educational establishments around Vienna, and obviously Universität Wien is for us one of the most important. Now, our distinguished guest this year is also the Albert Hirschman Fellow at the IWM, Seyla Benhabib. She is the Eugene Mayer Professor of Political Science and Philosophy Emerita at Yale University, currently also Scholar in Residence at Columbia Law School, and Professor Adjunct of Law, where she teaches legal and political theory, as well as a course on refugee, migration, and citizenship law, in a comparative course on refugee, migration, and citizenship law. Her numerous publications have been translated into more than 12 languages, and she has received various prizes, held many prestigious visiting professorships. Now, the title of today's lecture is From the Hermeneutics of Suspicion to Reconstructing Cosmopolitan Law. And although I wasn't able to come to the first talk, I did watch it online, and I'm intrigued to see how Professor Benhabib is going to contrast liberal nationalism with liberal internationalism in today's talk, which is one of the things she promised us. So it's my pleasure to give the floor now to Professor Seyla Benhabib, and after that we can have questions from the audience, a discussion for 25 minutes or so. Professor Benhabib, please.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Director Glenny. Dear colleagues and students, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I want to express my gratitude to the IWM again for having sponsored the Albert Hirschman lectures this year, for making me the fellow. And I want to thank you all for adjusting your schedules. And I'm sorry I was unable to hold a lecture last week. Every so often I may need to clear my throat. I hope you will bear with me. Now, I also have to figure out how to use this. I have a lecture. The PowerPoint is just to follow a couple of quotes. In my first lecture, I have analyzed contemporary debates on cosmopolitanism and have discussed disillusionment with the Cosmopolitan project. This disillusionment is rooted in political and historical developments which signal the unraveling of the world of the post-World War II international order. The many crises of the European Union, Brexit, the rise of autocracies and authoritarianisms all over the world, the return to power of parties with a fascist path or with sympathies to Nazism are developments which have rattled conceptions of universal human rights, as well as the ideal of peace among nations to be achieved through a rule-based international order. To defend cosmopolitanism in view of these changes in world politics, and in view also of the massacres in the Middle East and the Armageddon, which seems to have broken out there, may be behaving like the proverbial ostrich, burying its head in the sand. But the question is, what alternatives are being offered? How can the task of reconstruction instead of the hermeneutics of suspicion proceed? I begin today by considering an essay by Sylvia Wynter. This essay is not just a post-colonial critique of the ideals of the old humanism, but it pushes us towards a reconsideration of the modernist project in the direction of a less Eurocentric and more global vision. I will then turn to the work of a group of scholars who named, first accident. I will then turn to the work of a group of scholars who name their contributions 12 third world approaches to international law.
Okay.
And then I will come to look in greater detail to liberal nationalism, as I have called it in my first lecture. My thesis is that there have been significant developments which have shifted international law from a Eurocentric and state-oriented perspective towards a more cosmopolitan dimension, very much along the lines envisaged by Immanuel Kant as Völkerrecht and Kosmopolitisches Recht. These developments, I will argue, enable us to anticipate a global perspective which needs to be freed from simple identification with neoliberal globalization. How can we share the globe as the Earth and as the planet, as I will elaborate in my next lecture, beyond the ravages inflicted by financial neoliberal capitalism? So let me begin with Sylvia Wynter. Sylvia Wynter is a Jamaican novelist, dramatist, critic, philosopher, and essayist whose work combines Latin American, Caribbean, and Spanish histories and literature. She is a most articulate representative of what I have called another cosmopolitanism in other works. In her essay, with the unseemly title, I don't advise any student to name an essay like this, but Unsettling the Coloniality of Being, Power, Truth, Freedom, Towards the Human After Man, its overrepresentation and argument. It really is a terrible title, but it's a good essay. Wynter gives an alternative account of the genealogy of modernity, which she summarizes as follows. One of the major empirical effects would be the rise of Europe and its construction of the world civilization on the one hand, and on the other, African enslavement, Latin American conquest, and Asian subjugation, end of quote. Following the work of Afro-Caribbean intellectuals such as Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon, Wynter situates the development of the ideal of man, der Mann, okay, as the hegemonic interpretation of the human, der Mensch. So throughout the essay, she's playing with man, Mann und Mensch. This is the equivocation in this context. According to Wynter, to unsettle the coloniality of the dominant understandings of being, power, truth, and freedom, one must engage in a redescription of the human outside the terms of our present descriptive statement of the human as man. Wynter's language is dense and at times apocalyptic. We are never really understand what she means by being, with capital B, and how much Heidegger is being referenced here. Nor are we told what truth, power, and freedom mean for her. Still, there is a lot to be learned from her alternative accounts of modernity and the critique of man in the name of a new subjectivity. At a crucial point of the text, Wynter discusses the famous debate between Bartolomé de las Casas and Juan Inés de Sepúlveda in the 16th century, whether the American Indians conquered by the Spanish during the invasion of Central and South America have souls, or whether they should be enslaved, exterminated, or converted. In Wynter's telling, King Ferdinand of Spain set up the councils of jurists and theologians to enable them to come up with a formula that would justify the Spanish conquest. Confronted with the practice of human sacrifice among the Aztecs, Sepúlveda would justify their devastation on domination by the troops of the Spanish crown on the grounds that they lacked reason, and hence they could not see the truths of Christianity. Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a priest and lived for many years among the Amerindians, Indians, would argue that they did possess reason, but were mistaken in its right use. The proper evangelist should teach the natives of right reason towards acknowledging Christ to save their soul. Let me insert a personal anecdote. As a Sephardic Jew from Turkey, my own history is deeply bound up with this story. As Jews, we were persecuted in Spain throughout the 15th century under the doctrine of the limpieza de la sangre, the cleanliness of blood. Sephardic Jews were not only exiled from the Catholic Kingdom of Spain, starting in 1492, but even those who remained and converted to Christianity were persecuted for many decades for being crypto-Christians, i.e. Crypto-Christians, that is, i.e. Marranos or conversos. Whereas the many nations and peoples of the Americas, Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean islands are the constitutive exterior of European ideals of the human being, Jews were Christian Europe's constitutive interior, let me say. Their loyalty to their own God and their refusal to convert to the truths of Christianity were often considered signs of irrationality and disloyalty to their host political authorities. Through her reconstruction of the famous Las Casas and Sepúlveda episode, Wynter reaches the conclusion that the projected space of otherness was now to be mapped on phenotypical and cultural differences between human variations and population groups, while the new idea of order was to be defined in terms of degrees of rational perfection and imperfection as degrees sustainably established by the Greco-Christian cultural construct deployed by the Sepúlveda as that of the law of nature. I mean, it was argued that, in fact, the domination of the Amerindians by the Spanish crown also was in conformity with the laws of nature. We witness in this episode the imbrication of classical Greek thought with Christian theology in the service of the construction of man as the being endowed with reason, zon, logon, ethon, or then as the animal rational. The thought of pagan Greece and Rome is used to legitimize modern states' rise to hegemony and its devastation and domination of other cultures. What this means, of course, is that the ideal of rational humanity gets deeply entangled with the emergence of Western colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism. Nevertheless, you will be relieved to know we cannot stop here. We need to go beyond this hermeneutics of suspicion towards a more inclusive universalism as I have tried to develop it in various works in a communicative ethics. Communicative ethics enjoins what I call an interactive universalism, emerging out of the dialogue and encounter with others. Such dialogic practices are contentious, and there will be moments when communication can and does break down, be it to be resumed at another, more auspicious moment. But what distinguishes interactive universalism from a simple dismissal of the standpoint of the other as not adequate to rational thought or natural law are the deep modernist Kantian commitments to the ideals of equality and mutual respect. Here, Hannah Arendt's reading of Kant lectures on Kant's critique of judgment uncovers the link between cosmopolitanism and interactive universalism in the following way. In his theory of judgment, Kritik der Urteilskraft, Kant distinguishes between reflective, reflektierende, and determinative, bestimmende judgment, bestimmende Urteilskraft. No? Whereas in cases, argues Kant, of determinative judgment, the universal, das Allgemeine, by which is meant the principle or the criteria, in terms of which the particular is given, okay? In reflective judgments, particularly in judgments concerning beauty and taste, one has to seek the appropriate universal. That is the principle or the criteria in light of which to evaluate the particular. How can we justify our judgment, says Kant, when I say this painting is beautiful? It's not as if there is a universal principle under which you say this is a painting, therefore it is beautiful. Now, the genius of Hannah Arendt is to interpret Kant's critique of judgment in the context of his moral and political philosophy. She departs, both follows and departs, and for me this is a great opening to move out of the hermeneutics of suspicion. Arendt, following Kant, characterizes the mental activity of comparing my judgment with the judgment of others, and this is also Kant's term, die erweiterte Denkungsart. With reference to search for the appropriate principle of reflective judgment, she writes, the power of judgment rests on a potential agreement with others, and the thinking process which is active in judging something is not, like the thought process of pure reasoning, a dialogue between me and myself, but finds itself always and primarily, even if I am quite alone in making up my mind, in an anticipated communication with others, with whom I know I must finally come to an agreement. And this enlarged way of thinking, which as judgment knows how to transcend its individual limitations, cannot function in strict solitude, okay? It needs the presence of others in whose place it must think, whose perspective it must take into consideration, and without whom it never has the opportunity to operate at all. It's a complicated quote, but the fundamental idea here is that the validity of our judgments require our capacity to be anticipated, the perspective of others. The erweiterte Denkungsart, or the enlarged mentality, anticipates the communication with the other, with whom I must finally reach some kind of understanding. Such understanding can always be revised, reopened, and reconsidered. There can be no finality to such dialogues. In this process, our imagination must travel towards the other. We must correct Arendt's statement of Kant in this one respect. Postcolonial thinkers such as Sylvia, Wynter, and others show us that it would be hubristic to think in the place of the other. Rather, taking the other's perspectives into consideration must involve learning from the other and a genuine encounter with others as conversation partners, not only through or dialogue, but also through what I would call projects of world building and sharing by common engagements and in practices and institutions. We must ask, what would be the principles of coexistence in a world in which alternative paths to modernity have to coexist? How can interactive universalism be thought of not just in the domain of moral philosophy, but more concretely as a form of institution building and world sharing? And it's at this point that I want to turn here to attempts to decolonize international law towards a more interactive, cosmopolitan perspective. Okay? In recent years, a group of scholars referring to their contributions, this is a name that they attribute to themselves, as TWAIL, or Third World Approaches to International Law, have advocated a transnational and postcolonial perspective which moves the idea of cosmopolitan law in the right direction. Beginning with the pioneering work of Anthony Angie in imperialism and imperialism, sovereignty, and the making of international law. Okay? He's a law professor at the National University of Singapore, Secretary General of the Asian Society, and is a very important book, 2005. Okay, so in this work, Angie analyzes and makes us aware of doctrines, practices, and judgments in international law which perpetrate the inequality among states that lie at the very origins of the post-World War II system of international law institutions. And she points out how the end of the First World War gave rise to the mandate system over previously colonial possessions and created the category of dependent sovereignties. The mandate system, he writes, by adopting the concept of trusteeship, which was another concept, justified the management of colonized people by presenting it as directed by concern for native interests and a desire to promote self-government, rather than by the selfish desires of the colonial powers, end of quote. Yet even after the era of decolonization at the end of the 1960s, when former colonies attained their independence, intense controversies resulted over the doctrine of permanent sovereignty over natural resources, which would have permitted these countries, the developing countries, to further their own interests without being subject to the power of Western international corporations that would subsidize and encourage the appetite for cheap credit of the corrupt and autocratic rulers in these countries. Plans for a new international economic order were developed in order to reverse the effects of colonialism. After the evolution of decolonization, categories of cultural difference were transformed into economic differences, such as between developed, underdeveloped, and developing. Such distinctions became central to the operation of Bretton Woods institutions, which formulated even new techniques for maintaining relations of inequality and hierarchy, which had first emerged out of the colonial encounter from the 15th to the 19th centuries. After considering these developments, Angie reaches a provocative conclusion. International law, he writes, is in a permanent state of emergency. It could not be otherwise over the centuries, given that international law has endlessly reached out towards universality, expanding, confronting, including, and suppressing the different societies and peoples it encountered, end of quote. And she does not conclude that interactive universalism, based on principles of communication and world sharing between the colonized and their erstwhile colonizers, is impossible. And he believes that international law can be transformed so that the marginalized can be empowered. It is through the vocabulary of international law and concepts of self-defense, human rights, and humanitarian interventions, he writes, that issues of cause, responsibility, and fault are being discussed and analyzed, and interpretation of these doctrines, which reproduce imperial relations, must be contested. End of quote. Although plans for a new international economic order, which were proposed in order to reverse the effects of colonialism, were rejected right away by the United States, principles of the UNIEO were still adopted by the UN in 1974 via a declaration for the establishment of a new economic order. In other words, there have been intermittent efforts to create an international economic order based on sovereign equality, interdependence, mutuality, and cooperation among nations. But in the intervening decades, neoliberal financial capitalism has gained ascendancy and buried all these plans in the distant past. Now, I'd like to briefly talk about Tendai Achiume and her contribution. She was a former special rapporteur from 2017 to 2022 to the United Nations on contemporary forms of racism. She undertakes to reconstruct international law to serve the interests of justice of former colonial subjects. Achiume takes aim at the concept of exclusive sovereignty, which is the dominant hegemonic conception of Western and Northern liberal democracies, which permits them to exclude migrants and asylum seekers from their shores. When thinking about migration and the so-called refugee crisis of today, she proposes to remind us that from 1880 to 1930, 40 million people migrated from Europe to lands which were considered terra nullius in the rest of the world, empty lands. During this time, the forced migration of indentured servants and slave populations to these lands numbered between 12 to 37 million people. In view of this historical legacy, Achiume turns to today's migration flows and insists that to decolonize international law, we must deconstruct some distinctions which bear the mark of their historical origins. Now, this is where her work gets a bit technical, and I don't want to bear your patience, and these are very controversial issues, obviously, within the context not just of Europe, but look at what's happening in the United States and many other countries. Achiume pays attention, and I'm going to skip this section to come to liberal nationalism. She performs a critique of the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees. And despite the fact that 162 nations are parties to this convention, this does not change the fact that the countries receiving the largest number, and I'm going to say IDP, internally displaced person, that's a more inclusive category than refugee, that the largest number of countries, or the countries receiving the largest number of IDPs in today's world, are still in the developing world and the global south. Turkey, Islamic Republic of Iran, Colombia, Pakistan, with only Germany in Europe approaching these numbers with about 1 million asylum seekers or refugees. Now, as I said, I don't want to get into the technicalities here. If you wish, we can elaborate this in the discussion. But one of the central markers of the 1951 Convention is a distinction between the politically persecuted refugee versus the economic migrant. And today there is a lot of discussion in the international law community about whether the markers of persecution identified as identified as race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, are not really legacies of the Cold War, period. And whether, in effect, they can enable us to distinguish economic poverty, exploitation, and marginalization strictly from persecution. So this is the big discussion within the international law community, and most legal scholars say don't touch it because we could never have a 51 convention again. But what Eshiume is doing as a legal scholar is saying that this distinction between the politically persecuted refugee and the economically opportunist migrant is inadequate from the perspective of global redistributive justice. In fact, she argues that migration should be viewed as a decolonial move. I can see what this discussion would do in Europe. It probably will not have a chance, but one should pursue a consistent argument and see where this is going. And so Eshiume demands a new conceptualization of sovereignty that would obligate former colonial powers to admit that their erstwhile colonized subjects should be regarded as co-sovereigns. And she has a complicated formula to try to show that, in fact, erstwhile colonial subjects participate in the generation of economic wealth. Now, what implications does all this work have for normative political thought and for cosmopolitanism in our times? So here I come to political theory and, again, cosmopolitanism, trying to integrate some of these insights. Let me reconstruct here 4 ideal types of normative thinking about macro, political, and economic institutions, and consider what light 12 criticisms add to this perspective. In my first lecture, I had characterized liberal nationalism as the claim that without well-protected borders, there can be no democratic self-governance. There must be a centralized agent of some kind that takes responsibility for protecting a country's natural and material assets, and that ensures continuity for its public, culture, and democratic values. Immigration and transnational movements across borders are permitted, but the regulation of their quantity and quality remains sovereign privileges. Countries may admit more or less numbers of refugees and acknowledge the claims of asylum seekers, but they also have the right to regulate their labor markets and to turn away strangers. Although liberal nationalists consider it desirable that their legislatures should act in accordance with international law, what counts in the first place is our law, our precedents, and our values. And as I said, this has a formidable array of political theorists at the present. Rawls, Walzer, Nagel, David Miller, and Martha Nussbaum defending it. So it's a tough position to criticize. The weakness of the liberal nationalist position is that it wholly neglects international law constraints on sovereignty by constructing state sovereignty as if it were solely defined by the self-assertion of the demos. This perspective appears natural to many political theorists, particularly in the United States, who, willingly or not, seem to share the supreme skepticism and distance which has recently developed in the US Supreme Court towards international law. In that sense, David Miller's book on liberal nationalism does engage in a more nuanced way with international law, which you don't find in other thinkers. Liberal internationalists among whom I consider Anne-Marie Slaughter, Harold Coe, Michael Doyle, among others, argue that it is wrong to think of sovereignty as a unilateral prerogative to be wielded against other sovereigns. Rather, states exist within regimes of sovereignty that change over time. The Westphalian model of the absolute jurisdiction of a central authority over all that is living and dead on its territory is a myth of the past, if it was ever a historical reality that will, and in fact there's a great deal of good historical work showing that Westphalia is a myth, basically, that we use as a shorthand in international theory. For liberal internationalists, sovereignty is exercised within a system of international law and is regulated by institutions such as, in the post-war period, the United Nations Charter, the UDHR, and regimes of human rights that have emerged in the aftermath of World War II. States must respect their obligations under international law. In the protection of their borders, they must balance self-interest with international obligations. Such balancing, argue liberal internationalists, is beneficial economically as well, because international prosperity requires respect. Oops. Sorry. Let me find my place here. No problem. Okay. All right, here we are. Okay. Liberal internationals argue that while respecting their obligations under international law, states have the prerogative to define their labor market policies as they choose. Migration models that privilege meritocracy, or those that give first priority to family affiliations, are both acceptable. The rights of strangers among us ought to be determined, argue the internationalists, with national, regional, as well as international norms and agreements. But unlike Angie and Achiume, in their consideration of the evolution of the doctrines and categories of international law, liberal internationalists do not take account of the history of colonialism and imperialism. And they assume that the post-World War II international order will have resolved these issues. Now, let me turn to a third category, and this is a bit new for me. So we'll see how this goes. I'm calling this Neoliberal Globus. I want to distinguish here this third position, both from liberal nationalists and liberal internationalists. Neoliberal globalists, I'm thinking here, I deal typically of Friedrich Hayek, and some in this audience probably know him much better than I do. Milton Friedman, the early Thomas Friedman. What was that thing called? The Lexus and the something tree.
The olive tree.
Yes, thank you. I mean, Friedman has changed, right? And the editorial writers of the Wall Street Journal. They defend the unimpeded free movement of commodities, services, and persons across borders. The market certainly requires the protection of laws of property, credit, and contractual transition, they admit. But the less the state interferes in the behavior of individuals and firms and restricts itself to protect the rights of consumers and service providers, the better off everyone will be. Whereas liberal internationalists conceive of the international order in terms of macro institutions regulating interstate behavior, for neoliberal globalists, the international order is an emanation of financial and commercial market networks. State interference is not wished. In fact, neoliberal capitalism weakens the regulatory power of states in several respects. First, it controls the creditworthiness of states through the creation of transnational credit assessing agencies, and this in turn affects the capacity of states to act as borrowers in the international market. Second, in order to guarantee freedom of production, trade and exchange, which would avoid the regulation of wages, work, health, and sanitary conditions, multinationals create zones of economic development in which they attain concessions on vulnerable and weak states. An additional practice of avoiding the regulatory power of states, which has emerged in recent years, is so-called legal forum shopping, whereby multinational corporations incorporate themselves on convenient territories, such as to avoid tax obligations in countries where they originate. They are then free to negotiate the terms of their legal contracts and education as they see fit. Neoliberal globalists assume that the most fundamental human rights are the freedom of property and contract. All others are secondary and can follow suit. Now, I felt the need to introduce some kind of characterization of neoliberal globalization, and there's a lot more to be said here, because there is a consistent confusion of cosmopolitanism right now with neoliberal globalization on the part of the theoretical critics of cosmopolitanism. I've not only been asked this question by very close theoretical friends, but also if you have followed Wolfgang Streeck's critique of cosmopolitanism, there is permanently this conflation. And so I want to try to make a distinction here about the kind of cosmopolitanism that I am endorsing. The cosmopolitan position, like the neoliberal globalist, pushes liberal nationalism and internationalism beyond the perspective of the state, which, whether liberal or not, privileges an ontology of containment that denies the radical fluidity, historical variability, and interdependence of peoples, histories, cultures, and territories. Cosmopolitanism proceeds from the premise that human mobility is an anthropologically deep-seated drive of the human species, and that the regulation of human motility through national borders is quite recent in human history and must not be retried and regarded as if it were a fact of nature. Intelligent and human solutions, I believe, to the regulation of the ever-increasing cross-border movements of peoples can be found. Unlike for the globalists, however, the cosmopolitanism that I defend is not a plea for a world without borders. I've always argued that democracies require jurisdictional boundaries. In that sense, the liberal nationalists are right. We must know in whose name the law is being enacted and how we can request accountability from those who enact it as well as those who break it. We need national as well as transnational and international courts to defend the protection and enhancement of human rights, as well as the punishment of perpetrators who violate them. But these jurisdictional boundaries need not be coterminous with militarily armed and violently guarded border regimes. If we move our gaze below as well as above the level of the state, we see that cities, municipalities, regions, and borderlands shape and define the interdependence of citizens and strangers. Cosmopolitans insist that migratory movements lead to the search for work or seeking asylum and refuge occur because of pull and push factors. The most salient of these factors can only be identified by focusing on regional economies as well as the political economy of borderlands. The cosmopolitan perspective enjoins us to investigate and analyze, much prior to the migrant and refugee arriving at the door, how our national and regional policies contribute to such movements. Both the liberal nationalists and the internationalists, by contrast, treat migratory movements primarily as matters to be regulated, governed, controlled, and now increasingly criminalized. As Tendai Ashime observes, and I'm moving towards a conclusion, quote, achieving an ideal form of global migration governance would, in other words, require remedying the fatally flawed conception of state sovereignty in the heart of international law, and which nation states are strongly incentivized to protect end of quote. At the level of ideal theory, then, the task is to reconceptualize how democratic self-determination can be embedded in a new law of interdependent sovereignties. Neoliberal globalization undermines such sovereignty not for the sake of guaranteeing greater interdependence, but for the sake of protecting the freedoms of the market. Now, it would be remiss of me, here in Vienna, not to mention the contributions of Hans Kelsen to this vision of cosmopolitanism, in case you thought that this was like some wild fantasies about sovereignty that are emerging out of him. Kelsen, as is well known, was one of the most trenchant critics of sovereignty, even if not from the perspective of migration and refugee rights. Rejecting sovereignty's pretensions to be an institution beyond the law, Kelsen declared that the constitution-creating act must be viewed as a transcendental fiction from whose authority emanated a basic norm, a Grundnorm, to found all subsequent authority. As is also well known, Carl Schmitt would criticize Kelsen and ridicule the idea that the founding act of a people could be considered a transcendental fiction alone. Instead, argued Schmitt, it was the concrete existence, okay, with all the meanings of the word concrete in Schmitt, right? The concrete existence of a folk from which the Constitution originated and to which it owed its legitimacy. The tension between demos and folk, between the people, conceptualized as united under a constitutional order, which renders sovereignty subject to basic norms, versus the vision of the people, conceptualized as an ethno-national community of fate and a Schicksalsgemeinschaft, is one of the fundamental distinctions in the history of political thought and international law and jurisprudence. Whereas Kelsen thought that the perspectives of national and that of international law could ultimately be reconciled. For him, it was a matter of which epistemological perspective he chose to adopt, whether that of the nation state, whether international law. In our world, the conflict and tension between these two perspectives has only intensified, and I need not even say a word about the Middle East right now. The point is not to deny that every demos is also an ethnos, or a collection of ethnoi, but to show how the perspectives of the ethnoi and the demoi can be mediated by a kind of transnational cosmopolitanism based on the principles of interactive universalism. For this purpose, it would be wholly wrong to dismiss the advances of international law in the post-World War II period, which have prohibited the aggressive use of war, interdicted genocide, ethnic cleansing, and slavery through various conventions and use cogence norms from which states ought not to deviate. In that sense, they are different than agreements. Whereas the practitioners of hermeneutics of suspicion continue to reduce this legal order to the service of hegemonic powers alone, and view with self-justifying glee when Russia exits the Rome's statute of the International Criminal Court, I side with Hans Kelsen and other cosmopolitan jurists who envisage a world not without conflict, but a world in which conflicts would be settled via law, politics, and policy, and not via war and destruction. Of course, Russia is not the only superpower which has left the ICC. Neither the United States, which first signed into it and then exited the ICC, nor China are members. However, just as any other institution which combines normativity and facticity, or what Jürgen Habermas called Faktizität und Geltung, international law through its institutions, networks, and associations must be subject to critique and reconstruction. By highlighting the work of 12 scholars in this lecture, I've tried to show that this critical task of normative reconstruction is under way. Certainly, these are preliminary efforts, but Angie's and Achiuma's contributions point in the same direction to critique the history of international law as it was tangled up with European imperialism and colonialism, and yet nevertheless to find ways of defending doctrines of permanent sovereignty over national resources as well as co-sovereignty in rethinking principles of coexistence in a shared world. Last paragraph. In my next and final lecture, I'm going to distinguish among three dimensions of globality as the world, the earth, and the planet. Globalists are surely correct that as a consequence of economic and technological developments, we have reached an unprecedented intensity in time and space in the movement of news and people, services and micros, fashion and money across borders. How can we think of these new dimensions of the Globus, therefore, beyond the utopias of the free market? And how can we reconstruct cosmopolitanism in the light of these various dimensions? So, thank you for listening, and I think we will have a question and answer period. Yes. Assembling my notes here.
So, thank you very much, Seyla. I'm going to exploit my position as chair to ask the first question, and that was, I was intrigued by the need you felt to differentiate between liberal internationalism and neoliberal globalization, inasmuch that liberal internationalism, and Anne-Marie Slaughter was certainly one of those who argued this, emerged in the 1990s as a very powerful political tool, articulated in particular by Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, seemed very much in harmony to me with the writings of Tom Friedman and, to an extent, Hayek and Milton Friedman as well. And I was struggling to differentiate the two concepts as liberal internationalism, as I said, was articulated first in Kosovo, then in Afghanistan, and then in Iraq. So is there a fundamental difference between those two?
Fundamental, maybe hard to put, but there certainly is a difference in emphases. I think that when I think of the work of Harold Cole, who is my colleague at Yale and from whom I have learned a great deal, I think there are among liberal internationalists those who are much more emphatic about the project of human rights and maybe more skeptical that market values as well as interventionist state building would help the project of human rights. I think that that would be a matter of emphasis, but you're right that it is maybe more a question of shading and nuances rather than fundamental distinctions. I mean, after all, you know, liberal internationalism, I mean, is a position that goes back to all the neo-Kantian lawyers also, you know, all jurists, and of course, Hans Kelsen being the greatest among them. So in that sense, that theory and that point of view has a much longer history than its re-emergence with, you know, Clinton and Blair. But yes, thank you for that question.
And I've got just one other observation, which I thought I was prompted by your reference to the Sephardic Jews of the Iberian Peninsula. And that was, of course, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them migrated into the Ottoman Empire.
Like my forefathers.
Like your forefathers, and settled there actually very comfortably. And it seems to me as though, because of the fact that we look at the Ottoman Empire through the prism of the 19th century and its collapse, and the bloodshed associated with its collapse, that we forget that in some respects the Ottoman Empire was an example of cosmopolitanism, of how communities were able to exist together within a functioning state system.
Well, I could say a lot about this personally as well as theoretically, but I'll just quote a phrase in Spanish that my mother used to say, and the Turkish state never really quite believed it. I mean, my mother used to say, for those of you who know Spanish, venimos antes 500 años, which meant something like we came 500 years ago. You know, we came with the conquest of Istanbul, so to speak. But there is a chapter to be written about cosmopolitanism and empire. And I think there is now, increasingly some interesting work that is being done about the histories of empire but what would be and cosmopolitanism, what would be the distinction between the kind of, after all, in the Habsburg Empire as well, about which I certainly know less than the Ottoman, but what would be the distinction between the modern and the historically existing forms of cosmopolitanism? Of course, the distinction would be that under those imperial regimes, individuals are fundamentally members of the particular ethnoid to which they belong. And there are no universal rights. These communities govern themselves. There is no general, constitution. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, there was a great debate in Austria among the Austrian socialists about what kind of law, in fact, would be appropriate for the various communities. So in that sense, cosmopolitanism under empires does not proceed from individual equality, but the balancing and peace among the rights of the various communities. I mean, that is the fundamental distinction. And to complicate matters, there are some theorists who don't like the European Union, some American conservatives, who basically say the European Union is another empire now under the hegemony, the economic hegemony of Germany. I don't think that this is quite correct, but they say it's a resurrection of a form of faulty cosmopolitanism. And it's all, smoke and mirrors to believe in the, European Charter of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, etc. But it is an interesting nerve point because this, of course, then also raises the question of what's the relationship between democracy and liberal nationalism. I mean, I am really trying to do justice in the lectures to these various positions, because when the people constitute themselves, I mean, historically the identification of the people with the nation is a well-known move, right? And we were discussing this in another conference as well. I mean, there used to be a traditional distinction between ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism. Civic nationalism being more the quote-unquote American and French kind, and ethnic nationalism attributed more to Austro-European under beginning with Germany. I mean, of course, in the current political context, everything is just, everything is just moving. American nationalism is becoming more and more, ethnocentric, and European nationalism is becoming more and more civic, I think. Not everywhere, not in every state, but in general. So these are some thoughts that the complex of cosmopolitanism and empire bring forth.
Thank you. Questions from the floor? Richard. Can you introduce yourself when you ask your question? Thank you.
Yes, I'm Richard Burke. I'm currently a visiting fellow at the EBM, normally based in Britain. I've actually got a question just for re-elucidation, actually, about the Trail project, and really what the implications of the argument might be, if I've got the argument right, the implications of a sort of fundamental challenge to jurisdiction and sovereignty between erstwhile European empires and, as it were, post-colonial states. So what is the projected or imagined institutional arrangement if jurisdiction is to have no bearing? But what would the structure of governance be? Would erstwhile colonial subjects vote in European elections, or, so that's a provocative way of putting the question, but in the end that's where we end up. So what is the institutional reality of the
Right. Fair enough, Richard. And I sort of left open whether or not I was going to defend this question of co-sovereignty. I think that primarily Ashima's work, and she's a very young scholar who has published two, three very major articles on this. She hasn't delved it. It's primarily in terms of understanding migration as quote-unquote a decolonial move. So she doesn't get into the question of co-governance, but reflects on how migration must be understood in terms of maybe distributed global justice as a kind of compensatory form of distributed global justice. And in one of her articles in Stanford Law Review, Migration as Decolonization, she has a very complicated economic formula, or in terms of which she's trying to calculate economic relations. I don't think it works, frankly. I don't think that works. I don't think that there is any way to do this. I mean, how are you going to calculate economically, what the Algerian occupation might have contributed to France to take a much simpler case than the colonial conquest of India. So I think that I think that you're absolutely right, saying how far can this go other than to see migration as a decolonial move. But I am bringing her work up, and I've criticized it a little bit more in another context, to just show that we need such creative reflection about this, and particularly this distinction between the economic migrant and the political refugee is such a point in the 51 Convention and in today's politics, right, that nobody even dare talk about it. And increasingly, the economic migrant becomes criminalized. Well, everybody's being criminalized right now, with recent developments also on the part of the European Council of Ministers, etc. But I do find her perspective in that sense provocative. One would have to make a more fine-tuned analysis of the concept of co-sovereignty.
You mean that nobody dares address the issue of a revision of that, of the definition. It's too politically...
It's too politically volatile. I mean, there are some, scholars, refugee scholars whose work I've taught in Paris, in Canadian scholar Frederic Maigret, who talks about the refugee also as the migrant. But I mean, just imagine politically, right? But I mean, scholars need not do what the politicians do. I mean, if an idea is correct and if there is a justification for questioning and these distinctions and so on, we must put the argument out there. But most international law scholars consider the 5 grounds of protection of the 51 Convention marked by the legacy of the Cold War at the time. Right? And it's very hard to separate out discrimination against race and religion from economic marginalization and oppression. How can you do that? If you are a Kurd in southeast or northeast Turkey, you will be both economically marginalized and also ethnically oppressed and politically oppressed. So what are we doing? What are we doing exactly? We are forcing something of a hypocrisy and dissimilitude on the part of agencies that are having to deal with this and on the part of legal agencies. Now, forgive me, I'm just going to add one thing here. Is there another way to think about this? Is there another conceptualization? My colleague Michael Doyle at Columbia, who is currently at Berlin, proposed something called a mobility convention to the United Nations. It is being discussed, and the idea of a mobility convention on mobility is to look at all sorts of movements of peoples across borders in terms of a general understanding of human mobility, to break down the criminalization of the categories, and to try to see what kinds of rights would be granted to what kinds of groups. I mean, this may even entail like something like, is it conceivable to think of something like a global labor market? I mean, this would be a kind of neoliberal project, right? But I mean, I think, Doyle and Scott are suggesting, can we, instead of, now I'm just talking out loud a little bit, bear my thought experiment. Instead of criminalizing the fellow from Cameroon who comes to Sicily, is it possible to have any kind of mechanism where you find resources, whatever, in Cameroon saying, we need 25 bricklayers or house painters? Come.
Well, of course, one of the ironies of our present situation is you have a chronic shortage of labour in the advanced economies, and you have a lot of people who want to offer their labour, but there is no mechanism for doing that, except while we're rejecting people at the borders, European countries are recruiting actively in Cameroon, in Senegal, and elsewhere for care workers, for hospital workers, and of course at the same time extracting those out of the local health and care services. So it's an utterly dysfunctional system, but it also points to the fact that what you're saying is that there is a rational way through this.
There can be. There can be. I mean, look at the discussion that we have recently had in New York, that has its own obligation, that everyone who asks for asylum must be granted a bed, Unterkunft. They must be provided accommodation. Now, this is a burden on the city. There are now close to, I believe, 100,000 people who have arrived. But the real burden is also that these people were not permitted to work. And so finally, Biden came up with a formula, which is very well known in Europe, that the temporary protective status was given to Venezuelans only. Don't ask me why Venezuelans and not Haitians, who are in much more dire states. And they were given now work permit, or work permits are coming along via temporary protective status. And I mean, this is going to cost Biden probably something in the election. But it was the right thing. It was the right thing to do, even though it is illogical from the standpoint of distinguishing among, among refugee groups. And in compensation, now more miles of the wall are being built. Sorry, I get very cynical, at a certain point, it's just like, okay, fine, but not finally, how irrational can you be? Sorry.
Let's have another question.
I'm from the University of Graz. I'm a philosopher, and we worked on cosmopolitanism. And I wanted to refer to the question, a very different question, not on economic and not on legal matters. What you think about the reflective cosmopolitanism, about Hansen and Delanty? Delanty and Hansen, they referred to education. And I think it's a very important issue, and they talk about a new frame of thinking, that we should get a new frame of thinking, and referring to education, because if you think about the refugees, there are 248 million of children out of school. And how can we get the new frame of thinking not only to and education? If you think about Hannah Arendt, she says it's very important to get education through dialogue. You refer to dialogue, and she refers also to subjective dialogue. And if you think about John Dewey, he refers to democracy and building up communities of inquiry. And I think I would like to ask you about what you think about cosmopolitanism in relation to education.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was a very good point. And what this means is, in some ways, relearning the way we teach history, relearning the way we do everything in a way, right? I mean, not everything, but in the human sciences, the cosmopolitan perspective is quite radical, and certainly the way colleagues who call themselves postcolonial and decolonial write and tell these is not the way I have learned history, right? Not my history, not international history. So the first transformation is going to be in the telling and the telling of history, and then how do we integrate these perspectives? And I know I worried a little bit about this in my first lecture, into the history of philosophy and into the history of maybe political thought. I mean, it's probably not by accident that cosmopolitanism is most developed in literary and cultural studies. A lot of the thinkers I have considered, some I have not discussed in the lecture, but they'll come out in the book, come out of literary studies where I think this transformation in perspective has been there since the work of Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, and comparative literary studies and so on. It's much more difficult. It's much more difficult to do it in many other disciplines. I mean, I'm talking now about the university. I'm not even talking about sort of the levels of secondary education where the relearning process would be much more extensive. But I think where we are going to have to begin is with the teaching of history, and some would say, people who are doing more deep ecology and so on, they may even say the reteaching of geography. I grew up in an old-fashioned but very good school system where I actually learned geography. I don't know if geography is taught in schools anymore. It certainly isn't taught in the American curricula. We have something they call social studies, which incorporates everything. But it's just like, how do you teach critical geography today?
And critical thinking.
Yes, of course. Critical thinking is, is just the meta premise for everything. But I'm just being a bit more specific in terms of what it would mean in secondary education as well.
I think we've got time for one more question. Okay, please.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to this refugee question. First, I think, yes, the Geneva Convention of 51 is the brainchild of the Cold War, in that sense, or it follows a logic, which, by the way, explains why you give preference to Venezuelans over Haitians. This is a kind of an after effect, because in Haiti's poverty, in Venezuela, you can say this is an ugly Marxist regime from which people are coming, and I think that this was the logic of the 51 Convention. But we should not forget that when the Geneva Convention was drafted in the 1940s, still many people in Africa, most people in Africa, and many in Asia were colonial subjects. And it's often overlooked that the Geneva Convention initially tried to exclude them. It had the so-called geographic reservation, meaning that only Europeans could ask for refugee status. So the Western European countries wanted to have given, a hand to so-called noble anti-communists living in Eastern Europe, but they didn't want their own colonial subjects to be empowered to ask for asylum when they were mistreated by their colonial masters, which were the French and at that time the Italians, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the Brits themselves. And it's only over time that with decolonization that we have countries lifting that geographic reservation, which was initiated in 1967 only. So there's an indirect link to the colonial times, I think, in the Geneva Convention. Now, I think the dilemma is that there's no political chance of expanding it under current, the public mood. But we have no new challenges like, for example, climate change. We have new challenges like, extreme poverty in certain areas of the world that is unaddressed. And so the question is how to do justice on a global level when we are confronted with that kind of new challenges. In numbers, when I think when the Geneva Convention was drafted, there were 2 billion people living on our planet. Today we are 8 already, something like that in the area, so it's a quadrupling of the people on our planet. And then I think and I would be happy to get a comment from you, there is a tension between an international redistribution, when you say we bring in migrants because they will profit from the wealth that has been generated, maybe even on the backs of their forefathers, or by their forefathers, which we are profiting from. But at the same time, when you have open societies and welfare states, it puts pressure on the welfare states bringing migrants, especially when they do not integrate quickly into the labor market. And you have national redistributive justice issues, that you have poorer people living on your own territory having to compete in a way with new migrants over certain scarce resources. At least empirically, you can make that argument. It's very difficult to have a very established welfare state at open border at the same time. And I think there's also a dilemma in that I at least perceive. But would be happy to get a comment from you.
Yes, I think all that is very true, and I feel that my voice is beginning to really.
I'm sorry, Seyla, we've strained you too much.
No, it may be that. I'll just say one thing. We know each other. I'll just say one thing. I think that migration alone cannot be an answer to global inequality. Yeah. We have to reconsider a lot of other issues. So forgive me, I have to stop here.
Well, anyway, thank you very much for battling your way through. And you're free to go to bed for the next week in preparation for lecture number 3.
Lecture number 3 is in 2 days.
Is it 2? Of course, because we jumped a week, haven't we? So go to bed for the next 2 days.
I'm sorry.